Welcome to Voices in Action, a new podcast by the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living about disability in Oregon. I'm your host, Leo Alanak. Over the course of this first season, we'll cover a variety of topics related to disability justice education, speak with leaders of local advocacy organizations, and learn from one another in the process. This week, we'll be discussing sex work. Sex work, which is currently criminalized in the U.S., is still a highly stigmatized field. Sex workers not only face state violence, but discrimination in many different aspects of their life. Even leftist groups often forget or outright refuse to advocate for sex workers in their politics, even though sex workers intersect with every other marginalized identity, and many are those most at risk of systemic harm. And, of course, many sex workers are disabled, as disabled people are often drawn to the work due to a variety of factors, such as the flexibility in hours, accessibility for those who need to work from home, and the overall autonomy in the work that many disabled people struggle to find elsewhere in our capitalist system. In this episode, I spoke with Corinne Hawk, a disabled sex worker and organizer with the Human Rights Commission for Oregon Sex Workers, and Jay St. James, a sex worker with cancer who previously worked with the Black Sex Worker Collective in Eugene.
My name is Corinne Hawk. I use she and they pronouns. I am a 28-year-old queer writer and disabled activist. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I've spent the past 7 years in the social service industry where I have worked with clients who are survivors of human trafficking, victims of child sexual exploitation, and consensual adult sex workers. I am also a former sex worker myself who, after many years of being in the vanilla world, am slowly transitioning back into getting into sex work. And I live in Asheville, North Carolina, but I have been working with the organizers and lobbyists in Oregon for the Oregon Sex Workers Committee to help with passing House Bill 3088, which will effectively just decriminalize sex work in Oregon. So yeah, that's me.
Can you talk a little bit about the Human Rights Commission for Oregon Sex Workers?
Yeah, so we have a committee it's comprised of all sex workers, by sex workers, for sex workers in Oregon. But we also have people from, I'm in North Carolina. We have people in New Zealand, just all over the US and the world that are just sort of coming together to help organize and bring resources together. We did just have a Human Rights Commission a couple weeks ago where we had commissioners. We have a blue ribbon committee and commissioners that include senators, city commissioners, academics, really, the people with lots of letters next to their names, just presenting a lot of the research and just talking about specific policies, as well as we had a ton of testimony of witnesses from advocates, activists, and also sex workers as well, just giving the public more information because there's not a lot of information on it. There's a lot of misinformation, and there hasn't been much of an opportunity in the Oregon legislature to present the public with the facts. It was presented to HB 3088 was presented to the legislator in early February, and it was just sort of it just died in the committee. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody knew anything about it. So we're trying to change that.
So how did you get connected with this org? Are you from Oregon?
I'm not. I've actually never even been to Oregon. I know.
Wow.
Yeah, I've connected with someone on Instagram. They were specifically looking for a disability activist to speak, or someone who had experience in the industry to speak. And it's hard. Sex work is a disability issue, but there are not a lot of disabled sex workers that can come out and speak on it because of just the harms that we can face, right? Just being a marginalized group and just sex work itself, it's hard for anyone to come out. So I was just happy to help where I can help.
So you mentioned disability, and I completely agree with you. So, how has your disability tied into your experience with sex work and sex work advocacy?
So I am kind of in this unique position where I did not develop my disability until after I left the industry. So I do not have experience of working in the industry, living with a disability, but a lot of my clientele were facing all manner of of things, right? Either struggling with just like anxiety or just like emotional stuff and mental health, or struggling with like physical disability, or just facing a lot of the ableism that makes it so that they can't have intimate sexual relationships and they have to seek them out, through sex workers. And now I'm kind of in this place where I'm going back into the industry, partially because of my disability and like what, like this is work that I enjoyed. And also like, I don't want to work a regular job. This isn't working for me. I need something that's more flexible, that has higher pay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's interesting to hear too about the clientele element too. So you're focusing then on, organizing for Oregon outside of Oregon. Is Oregon special then? Like, would this be the first state to pass a bill like this? Is it the first one like that even has it on the table?
So there are a few states that have been putting it on the table. I know New York is one. They were trying to do something in Louisiana. There's a couple states in the Bible Belt where they're trying to decriminalize. Probably not going to happen because it is the Bible Belt. New York looks like it might have a good shot. And Oregon is another place where like this bill has a good shot just because of y'all's history decriminalizing drugs, all sorts of stuff. You're like the leaders for human rights in America, the one safe haven in the US. So it's kind of like we're trying to make it happen. A lot of folks there was a lot of funding from New York organizations and people across the US and across the world that are coming together to try to get it pushed there. Because if we can get it taking place in one state, hopefully it will, spread out.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. So you talked about then how you've been a social justice organizer for a while now. How does your work with this organization intersect with other social justice movements that you have been a part of?
Yeah, I mean, sex work is extremely intersectional, and decriminalizing sex work has so many effects on so many groups. Let's just take like public health in terms of the rate of HIV and STDs decreases under decriminalization models. New Zealand is one of the only places, I think one of the only places in the world that has a fully decriminalized model. Well, they're not fully decriminalized. I think it's still criminalized if someone is an immigrant, has migrant status. But yeah, so New Zealand is a good example in terms of we can look at that's a fully decriminalized model, and we can see in the ways in which it affects all manners of groups. So in terms of folks who are living with disabilities, right, the rate of violence decreases significantly because we can actually report violence, right? And this occurs also like Black trans sex workers. I mean, just across the board everywhere, and including like the spread of HIV decreases, and also police violence, police brutality decreases. So it has a really far-reaching effect. It also, there's something to be said about like decriminalization is a model that like as an abolitionist or as abolitionists would need to be embraced in order to help decarcerate our state, right? Like we're no longer criminalizing this. So it has just a really far-reaching effect on all sorts of social justice movements. So
yeah, and I think those connections often get lost, especially when we're talking about the basic human right to have access to safety and healthcare that ties into the importance of legitimizing sex work. So could you explain a little bit about what decriminalizing sex work means? Is it different from legalization? How does that all play out?
Yes, thank you for asking this question. This is like the $1,000,000 question. Yeah, so decriminalization is different from legalization. It's different from partial legalization, and obviously it's different than criminalization. So right now we live in a criminalized model. And unless you live in like a small county in Nevada, like it is categorically illegal. So that means that if you are soliciting sex or if you are providing services for money, you can be arrested. So there's basically 4 different models. So there's the criminalization model, partial decriminalization model, full decriminalization, and then there's legalization. So decriminalization simply means that you cannot be arrested, you cannot be fined or placed in jail for soliciting sex or for providing services. This is different from legalization. A lot of times these two get conflated. Legalization it means that it would be regulated, and it would also mean that it is still criminalized in certain contexts. So this would really affect people who do not have the status or the resources to obtain whatever licensure they would probably need under a legal status. It also creates a situation where workers they kind of have less rights because in certain instances, they would have to work under like in a brothel or under management or something where they can be further exploited. Because in certain instances, brothel owners are traditionally, they're not sex workers. They're business people. And especially in an industry, the sex industry, which is not seen as a legitimate industry, rights are not upheld in the same way because it's not seen as a legitimate form of labor. So decriminalization creates a situation where people are able to have labor rights, and it also legitimizes that form of work. And so in the event that they're being exploited, they can, either physically or monetarily, they can seek out, I don't want to say retribution, but they can seek out help. So there's also there's kind of a push in the US for partial decriminalization, or what sex workers call the entrapment model, which is that it is legal for someone to provide services, but it is illegal for someone to pay for services. And there can even be, like, in certain instances, there's kind of been a push in Oregon for this partial model where maybe it's not criminalized that you're providing services, but if you get caught providing services, then you have to like go through like prostitution treatment court or whatever that means, where they're like, you have to get social services and we have to get you out of this industry, which is the US loves treatment court models because it's like, we don't actually have to get rid of prisons and the penal system. We just have to give people a bus pass or whatever, and that's going to fix their problems. So
yeah, no, definitely. And that's interesting then that decriminalization sounds like the kind of the best option, that, full legalization isn't the goal, because then you're kind of assimilating into like the capitalist model, which leads to more exploitation.
Yeah. It would really, I think something to think about too is like under a legalized model, I don't know. I just imagine like this like techno dystopia where like we have like Uber for like, for sex workers, but then like someone who's doing like street level work, that's already like difficult and like somewhat dangerous work. And then that's still criminalized and there's not resources for those people under a legalized model.
Yeah, no, it definitely, it like creates a hierarchy where there doesn't need to be one. So yeah, I think that's really helpful also to know in terms of like what people should be advocating for, right? When you don't have these conversations directly with sex workers or people who are impacted by it, you kind of go like, oh, well, logically, like we should want to legalize it, right? So like I'll push for that instead of decriminalization. And it's interesting also the entrapment model. I wonder what the purpose of that is. That's a very strange, like I'm not sure who benefits and how.
Yeah. It's the entrapment model, partial decriminalization model. It is big with like religious groups who kind of like refuse to use the term sex work. It's always like victim of human trafficking, those are two very different things, right? And the Dworkinists, so the feminist Dworkinists.
Dworkin feminists are those who ascribe to Andrea Dworkin, a controversial figure of second-wave feminism who fought to ban all pornography and viewed all heterosexual sex as, quote, coercive and degrading to women, end quote.
Yeah. I mean, that whole feminist discourse around sex and power and money and women being violated. I've even seen or read some Dworkinist critiques of sex work saying that like if sex work is work, then rape is theft and it's not actually rape. So it's a very warped view, and it sees all sex workers categorically as victims.
Yeah, that's not very helpful.
No, it's not.
It's not. Yeah, that's that lack of empowerment that seems supposed to be key to feminism, but then not recognizing autonomy. And something I didn't write down, but I don't know if you would feel comfortable speaking on it, is kind of explaining the difference between sex work and trafficking, because obviously they are very different, but to your point, lots of people conflate the two.
Yeah, so the difference between human trafficking and sex work, it's a really simple one. Adult consensual sex work is just that, it's consensual. Human trafficking is not. Human trafficking involves threat of violence, coercion, intimidation, force. It's violating someone's rights. And it's slavery, right? Like human trafficking is modern day slavery. When we talk about the difference between these two, consensual sex work and human trafficking, we usually only use those two terms. I personally like to use three terms. So I like to think of it in terms of like, there's consensual sex work, there's the sexual exploitation of children, and then there's human trafficking. This sexual exploitation of children falls under human trafficking, but I think it deserves its own category, really. So, but human trafficking, it includes labor trafficking, and really, I think it is essentially labor trafficking. But when we think about human trafficking, we only think of sex trafficking, and somehow sex trafficking is divorced from labor. And I think that really speaks to, kind of like this theme that we're sort of talking about, within this conversation we're having now, of how sex work is just not seen as a legitimate form of labor. So the issue, like when we're talking about human trafficking and sex work, is that these terms are used interchangeably, right, within the public's perception, but also within the designation of laws and the ways in which these laws are carried out. In the US, prostitution laws have been in place like pretty much since the inception of our penal code, but human trafficking laws have only existed for the past 20 years. So the federal law criminalizing human trafficking was passed in like 2000, like under the Bush administration. And the first state to criminalize human trafficking was Washington in 2003. So these laws are they're relatively new. And if we look at them, if we take a second and we look at these laws and what they have done, it's very clear that they have not accomplished what they have set out to accomplish, and they have caused a tremendous amount of harm. So because these terms, this misunderstanding we have about sex work and seeing sex workers as somehow both a victim and a criminal, and seeing sex work as like somehow as just like bad, and like because these terms are used interchangeably and we don't understand the two, adult consenting sex workers and adults who are paying for consensual sex are being charged with trafficking. And that's awful for someone who is not engaging in modern day sexual slavery to be charged with sex trafficking, human trafficking, and to have that follow them for the rest of their life when they are not exploiting someone and they are simply paying for consensual touch. Like, that's not okay. That's not okay. In addition to that, because consenting adults are being charged with trafficking, the rates of trafficking are being reported much higher than what is actually occurring. And this is really affecting our narrative around trafficking. And this is also affecting the way that law enforcement approaches trafficking. So, for example, the dominant narrative that we have around trafficking is like, it happens in urban areas. You can be walking down the street in a city and you're going to get like snatched up in like some sort of taken situation. And like, that's what's going to happen to you. I don't know what Oregon looks like. The rates of trafficking differ region to region. Let me just tell you about where I live in Appalachia. So in Appalachia, the highest rates of trafficking that are occurring here are occurring in rural areas. And it's happening in two places. We have parents, guardians, family members that are selling minors for money for drugs. And we also have a fair amount of religious cults in the state of North Carolina and throughout Appalachia that also participate in the sale of children. Part of that has to do with the drug trade. Also, that has to do with child brides. But these things are happening in rural areas. And the cause, like if we're talking about like the cause of the sale of children for money for drugs, that's due to the opiate epidemic. So if legislators are being asked by constituents to address human trafficking, if they're being lobbied by groups to address human trafficking, and they go and look at the data and they say, okay, where is human trafficking occurring? And the highest rates of trafficking are being recorded in urban areas because that is where a majority of the sex trafficking stings are taking place, and they are arresting consenting adult sex workers, and it has nothing to do with the opiate epidemic that is taking place in rural Appalachia, they're not going to be addressing that. That's not going to be their focus. The way that the laws are written and are carried out, even for victims, even victims of human trafficking, they're being harmed. If you're a victim of human trafficking, you will be charged with human trafficking, and that stays on your record. Unless your state has laws in place that circumvent that, there are laws in place that don't really shield you at all, but are just more hoops that you have to jump through of being a good victim, quote unquote, a good victim, to get that expunged from you, from your record. That follows you for the rest of your life. So we had a woman provide witness testimony at our Human Rights Commission in July, she was a victim of human trafficking. She got out. She went on to go to college to go get a nursing degree. She racked up all this debt. She went to go take her licensure exam, and she can't get licensed because she has a record, because she was charged with human trafficking, because she's a victim of human trafficking. That's horrible. That's absolutely horrible. That, like, one of the worst things that can happen to someone, and it just continues to follow you around and it's on your record for the rest of your life. That's absolutely horrendous. These laws that are being created, like the lobbyists that are pushing to create these laws and policies around trafficking, they're not survivors of human trafficking. These are religious groups that are creating these laws and pushing these laws. One of the biggest religious groups that has helped fund a lot of laws around the U.S. around human trafficking is also pushed, the SESTA and FOSTA laws, also, is pushing like anti-porn laws right now, the National Center to End Sexual Exploitation. There's a few other groups, but that's a really big one. One of the biggest issues, I think, is that like the research that supports good legislation is not readily available. And the research that is available is junk science that's funded by organizations like this. And it really panders to like these sort of oversimplified ideas that we have around sex and sex work and human trafficking. And so it creates a situation where we're like, oh, like porn is bad because of like this research, human trafficking, like this is what human trafficking is because I did a Google search and the National Center to End Sexual Exploitation said that this is what it is. And when in reality, like that seems like a really legit organization, but the reality, like that's a really, very conservative religious group that's putting information out there.
After the interview, Corinne added a clarifier that, quote, under decriminalization, the laws around the purchase of sex from someone under the age of 18 or the exploitation of children remains illegal, end quote.
Also, and as this relates to disability, the disability laws don't protect victims of human trafficking either. So, if you're a person living with a disability who is receiving some form of governmental assistance, if you get charged with prostitution or solicitation, you'll have your benefits terminated. This also applies to human trafficking. If you're a victim of human trafficking and you're charged with human trafficking, you will lose your governmental assistance. And if you want to get that reinstated, there's some level of severity that you have to demonstrate that occurred. Again, this is another thing. If you have to act like the good victim in order to get the funds that are rightly yours. I mean, this is horrible. These laws that we've created, these are horrible laws that are causing a tremendous amount of harm to people. The good thing, though, there's a good thing, is that the decriminalization model is the only model. It is the only model that is shown to decrease legitimate human trafficking. Because under a decriminalized model, you can ask for help. You can go to the authorities. You can go to the police, the people who are, exploiting someone, who are violating their rights, who are, keeping someone in sexual slavery, can be held legally accountable, and you won't go to jail. You won't be charged with human trafficking. You won't be, branded for the rest of your life. Decriminalization addresses these things and creates a situation where victims can get out. And, I just want to add also, if the reason that we're creating all of these laws is to end human trafficking, if that's what we're trying to do, if that's what we're telling ourselves, what we're trying to do is to end human trafficking, what we're actually doing when we arrest someone and we throw them in jail and we throw them in prison, regardless of if they're a sex worker or a victim of trafficking, is we're putting them into the largest human trafficking ring in the US, which is the for-profit prison system. So it's important for us to address that. It's important for us to take a hard look at, like, what are we actually doing? Because we're telling ourselves that we're helping people, but really we're aiding and abetting slavery. That's what we're doing when we put people in prison.
So we kind of talked about this already, but there's an overwhelming societal belief encouraged by media. You know, you'll see like Law and Order. I mean, really any like propaganda show, that sex work is harmful and dangerous. But based on your experience, if there is harm, what are some of the current sources?
This is always what I say when someone asks me this. Sex work can be dangerous work. It can be dangerous work. So is working on an oil rig or being a coal miner. Like, that is dangerous work. The difference is, like, there are labor standards to keep those workers safe. Whether or not OSHA decides to enforce them or not, that's a whole different conversation. But like, it is seen as a legitimate form of work. Those groups of laborists have the support from their community if they want to organize for better labor standards. If something happens, they have a means and like a system that they can go through to rectify some sort of wrong. The sex industry as a whole, not even just what is deemed as criminal sex work, but even like whatever issues might exist in the porn industry, or if you're working in a club, the problems that exist there exist because like this is a stigmatized form of labor and it's not seen as legitimate. And so sex workers don't have support from their community or really any power besides organizing themselves to get better labor standards. So as this goes to like decriminalization, what's dangerous about sex work, if we're talking about full service sex work, is because it's criminalized. It's because if something happens, you cannot go to a police officer and say like, hey, I was raped or I was assaulted. And for that matter, like, it continues to get more dangerous because of recent laws that have been passed, like through SESTA or FOSTA, which are the federal laws that have quote unquote like cracked down on like sex trafficking. But all it does is just like make it harder for sex workers to like find work or supplement their income or even stay safe. Like, we don't have a way we've been deplatformed, and so we don't have a way to like screen customers or clients or do background checks or find work in like safe ways.
A Vox article written by Aja Romano and published in July of 2018 expands on the more technical and legal implications of the bill. Quote, "The bills also poke a huge hole in a famous and long-standing safe harbor rule of the internet, Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. It holds that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider," end quote. In other words, Section 230 has allowed the internet to thrive on user-generated content without holding platforms and ISPs responsible for whatever those users might create. But FOSTA-SESTA creates an exception that means website publishers would be responsible if third parties are found to be posting ads for prostitution, including consensual sex work, on their platforms. The goal of this is supposed to be that policing online prostitution rings gets easier. What FOSTA and SESTA has actually done, however, is create confusion and immediate repercussions among a range of internet sites as they grapple with the ruling's sweeping language. In the immediate aftermath of SESTA's passage on March 21, 2018, numerous websites took action to censor or ban parts of their platforms in response. Not because those parts of the sites actually were promoting ads for prostitutes, but because policing them against the outside possibility that they might was just too hard. All of this bodes poorly for the internet as a whole. After all, as many opponents of the bill have pointed out, the law doesn't appear to do anything concrete to target illegal sex trafficking directly, and instead threatens to, quote, increase violence against the most marginalized, end quote. But it does make it a lot easier to censor free speech on small websites, as evidenced by the immediate ramifications the law has had across the internet. The bill arguably endangers rather than helps at least one class of sex workers: adults who want to do their work consensually and safely. And if we consider the increased amount of transparency around sex work that will be lost when sites like Backpage are shut down, it's also arguable that non-consensual victims of sex trafficking will become less visible and more vulnerable by being shunted away from the visible parts of the web into the deep web and dark corners of real life. All in all, FOSTA and SESTA is poised to put multiple vulnerable populations at a much higher risk. Because of Section 230, courts have a clear foundation for adjudicating free speech on the internet. And, crucially, because of Section 230, website owners and server hosts aren't constantly mired in endless lawsuits because someone said something inflammatory on one of their sites. Without this clause exempting websites from liability for the actions of their users, most websites simply couldn't afford to exist. They would have to perpetually ward off potential legal action based on the unpredictable behavior of their users by devoting endless resources to moderating everything their users did, by simply banning user activities altogether, or by throwing millions of dollars at litigation costs. The vast majority of the internet as we know it, all but a handful of websites run by tech companies with massive resources, which arguably couldn't have reached that status without Section 230's protections, would be unable to function under this kind of pressure. Enter FOSTA SESTA, which creates enforceable loopholes in websites if they appear to be allowing prostitution advertisements. That sounds specific, but it's not. FOSTA, a bill originally passed in February by the House, was initially set up to focus solely on sites like Backpage. That is, sites that seem designated just to give a space to sex workers. But by the time it had made it to the House floor, the bill had gained broader, sterner provisions borrowed from the Senate version of the bill, SESTA, provisions that included all websites. This then ballooned into the bill combo that wound up headed to President Trump's desk for signing. The EFF has called it, quote, a bad bill that turned into a worse bill and then was rushed through votes in both houses of Congress, end quote. Instead of directly targeting websites known to facilitate sex trafficking, the FOSTA-SESTA hybrid essentially sets up a template for broad-based censorship across the web. This means websites will have to decide whether to over-police their platforms for potential prostitution advertisements or to under-police them so they can maintain a know-nothing stance, which would likely be a very tricky claim to prove in court. The bill's language penalizes any websites that, quote, promote or facilitate prostitution, end quote, and allows authorities to pursue websites for, quote, knowingly assisting, facilitating, or supporting sex trafficking, end quote, which is vague enough to threaten everything from certain cryptocurrencies to porn videos to sites for perfectly legal escort services. In fact, one of the bill's main supporters, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, is arguably using the bill as a path to attack consensual adult pornography, which it has characterized as violent, degrading, and a public health crisis. There is one group that does stand to gain a significant amount from this bill package, a network of corporate giants ranging from Hollywood studios to Silicon Valley behemoths. Prior to SESTA's passage in the Senate, a parade of celebrities including Amy Schumer and Seth Meyers filmed a PSA to promote it as a tool to fight sex trafficking. Disney threw its weight behind SESTA in a letter to lawmakers supporting the bill, and 20th Century Fox followed suit. But while plenty of well-meaning individuals might have sincerely wanted to stop sex trafficking, as the name of the bill suggests, the motivations for the corporate entities that chose to back the bills are more suspect. The EFF argues that the reason for Hollywood studio interest in FOSTA-SESTA is that it lays the groundwork for the industry to institute automatic censorship and filtering against user speech. The purpose of this would be to simultaneously crack down on any potential copyright threats, namely with the use of automated copyright bots, while corralling user innovation and creativity through channels that are controlled and monitored by pre-existing companies. In other words, the long-term goal would be to cordon off the Wild West of the internet by dividing former free speech zones into spaces controlled by monetized, corporatized entities, a system that would also favor monopolization and unfair competition by industry giants over small internet startups. The tech giant Oracle lent its support to SESTA in a letter opinioning that any new startup could access virtually unlimited technology, and further argued that good technology companies were all about data monetization and user-based targeting, not, quote, blindly running platforms with no control of the content, end quote. It's important to note that at one point, tech giants like Facebook and Amazon were lobbying against FOSTA-SESTA through the internet group the Internet Association. But in the final months before the bills went to a vote, they backed off, switching from opposition to support after SESTA was changed to focus on platforms that provide knowing assistance to trafficking ventures. Similar to their strange, glaring silence in the face of renewed attacks on net neutrality, many tech industry leaders seem willing to compromise on issues that will ultimately debilitate their much smaller cohorts on the internet. Small dating sites, Craigslist, Reddit, and the user-driven nonprofit Wikipedia, which has stridently opposed the bill package, have made it clear they can't afford to suffer the long-term effects of FOSTA SESTA, at least not without drastically overhauling their sites and everything about the way those sites operate. It's possible that the courts could play a role in overturning all or part of FOSTA SESTA. The EFF is currently challenging the bill's legality in court on behalf of 3 different plaintiffs. One is a digital library, one a masseuse, and one an activist, whose various livelihoods are all jeopardized by the bill. But unless FOSTA SESTA is overturned, either by court rulings or by new legislator from Congress that doesn't seem to be forthcoming, those smaller sites might not have a choice. Whether or not Section 230 is ultimately weakened overall because of FOSTA SESTA, it seems clear that we're in a moment when many of the freedoms and protections we've previously assumed were woven into the fabric of the web are being systematically unraveled, challenged, and overridden by powerful special interest groups. If this keeps happening without abatement or countering, we will inevitably be faced with a drastically different, far less democratic version of the internet." End quote.
So yeah, I mean, it's the laws. The laws are essentially, and the laws and the stigma are what causes sex work to be quote unquote dangerous.
So what are some common misconceptions or prejudices people have when you speak about the work that you do?
I personally don't really give a shit. So there's that. And also, like, I'm fortunate enough that I haven't faced a lot of, haven't really faced a lot of stigma or discrimination. Even like I've more recently kind of come out to people and been like, hey, like this is work that I've done and this is work that I'm probably going to do in the future. And haven't really faced anything negative, but I know a lot of other folks have, I mean, just flat out discrimination, right? Like people being like losing their job or being forced out of school or, you know, losing their housing and stuff like this. I personally, though, I think what I have found has been the most unsettling stigma or like belief that other people hold is the idea that I don't have boundaries or that sex workers don't have boundaries. Like they don't have boundaries and you don't have to respect what they would consider like a normal boundary because of the work that we do.
Do you think that part of the reason you haven't come across that a lot is because of like circles that you're in, or more because you're seeing a more general acceptance and awareness of sex work as legitimate?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm white and I'm a cisgendered woman. And also, I think also because of the circles I'm in, like the industry that I work in, social services, like if you don't think sex work is work and you work in social services, I'm so sorry, you're in the wrong profession. Like, you know, so people tend to be pretty understanding and supportive of it, of whatever choices that people make. And I mean, there's a lot of shit in this industry as well. But so, yeah, I think it's maybe a combination of those two.
Isn't Instagram currently doing a sweep of sex workers too and removing them?
They are. I mean, it is because of that bill that was passed under Trump, the SESTA and FOSTA bill, that they are deplatforming people. I mean, just if you're not a cis-het white man and you talk about sex or post anything sexually suggestive, you are at risk of being taken off the internet. And it's also like SESTA and FOSTA is its own thing and it's awful. They're also trying to like basically like shut down. They're pretty much just trying to shut down porn on the internet right now. They're trying to push bills to do that as well. The anti-porn people are basically the ones that are driving a lot of the policies on the internet. And they are trying to take porn off of the internet. That is their goal. And we are all aware of like horror stories of like doxing or people like not giving consent and being like posted and stuff. People that I know who work in the porn industry who have content on Pornhub or some other site like that. The amount of stuff that you have to do that is like the amount of hoops you have to jump through to get on a site like that is insane. It's moderated more than like Facebook or Instagram. But yeah, they're trying with all their might to get that stuff off the internet. So
yeah, and that takes away the kind of way of connecting with people, right? I don't know, how generally people connect with clientele, but I know there was a lot of discourse about OnlyFans being switched over, like it was something that a lot of people had used, and then they're trying to switch over into like a more legitimate thing now and kind of kicking sex workers off when they're the ones who made it big in the first place. And then like, okay, what new site are they going to be able to use? And so that's gotta be just really frustrating. During the editing of this episode, OnlyFans announced that as of this October, they would no longer be allowing creators to post sexually explicit material, thus forcing the thousands of sex workers who built the site into a commodity off entirely.
Yeah, apparently OnlyFans as well. There was some other website, I don't remember what it was, but like way back in the days of the internet, that sex workers also built up similar to OnlyFans. And then they're like, we're going to make this legit. We're kicking all the sex workers off because now we have this big clientele and people know who we are. So we can like make vanilla content.
Yeah, try to kick all porn off the internet. It's like, all right, have fun deleting the internet. But
I know, right? I mean, it's so much research shows that where porn is easily accessible, where sex work is easily accessible, rates of violence, rates of rape, all of this stuff goes down, rates of abuse, all of this stuff goes down. And people don't realize as well, like if we legitimize this industry, if we work to destigmatize and legitimize the sex industry, whatever icky stuff that we have seen that exists in the sex industry can be addressed because people have the power to address the labor exploitation that's occurring where like that consent isn't discussed or like certain things are violated. Like people will have the power to address those things and we would collectively be more like sexually aware of ourselves as a society. So
you can't get anywhere not having these conversations. I mean, it's just an extension of like, well, teenagers won't have sex if we just teach them abstinence only.
Yeah.
Not having those conversations just causes more harm, more pregnancies, more STDs than it does actually stop that. So how can listeners support this advocacy work, this movement, and sex workers in general?
Well, first of all, if you consume any form of content made by a sex worker, if you watch porn, if you do anything, you should pay them. You should pay them. It's not free work. Also, I mean, OregonSexWorkers.org. You can go there and find out more about what we're doing in terms of like organizing. We did just have the Human Rights Commission, so there is a lot of information on there. We have a open drive with over 50 academic articles, a whole lot of research from every angle, so you can't argue with us about it. But also just like getting involved. We're kind of like moving into this space where like doing more like boots on the ground stuff of getting stuff going more locally so people are more aware of it. So yeah, that would be very helpful as well, just to get the word out.
So do you have any last thoughts or anything that you wanted to go over that we didn't get a chance to cover?
Oh yeah, I guess we talked about this a little bit. I don't know but just in terms of like the intersection of disability, there's the obvious, like in terms of work and being able to support oneself. But there are other countries like in Norway where a yearly stipend is provided to those who are disabled that they can freely use to purchase services from a sex worker. Just due to ableism, our sexual self is denied because, we're not able-bodied or whatever it is that you're supposed to be. And people's sexual self, like that's a human right. If you want to have sex and you haven't had sex, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. There's no reason why like you shouldn't be able to enjoy sexual touch or intimacy and know like have that very human experience. There's no reason why that should be denied to anyone. And that really affects folks who are living with disabilities. So sex workers provide a very real public service.
Next, I spoke with Jay St. James.
Yeah, so I am Jay St. James, Jay, and I work under the name Dead Flexi. I'm known as a political organizer and a full service and domination provider. So I'm also a parent to 4 children and 1 stepchild. I began street-based work as a teen with other teens, and I've written for Tits and Sass, Working It, and am a 2-time Best of Sex Work writer.
So what is your connection to sex work organizing in Oregon?
So currently I'm working more independently under an LLC race that I've started, but I've got a history in Oregon going back the entire 5 years I was there. I've worked for and spoken for Stroll. I've worked with Decrim Oregon and Solidarity Platform out of Lane County, and most recently Black Sex Worker Collective.
Yeah, so what is the Black Sex Worker Collective?
So, Black Sex Worker Collective is an artist collective, but there's definitely a political edge to it. There's a social justice, civil focused edge to it. And they began in New York and now branch across Europe, Jamaica, and the continental US.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved in sex work?
I actually began completely independently on my own. I was 14 years old. There was a kid that was maybe like 15, 16. He really wasn't that much older. He had a strong interest in me. He was around my friend group, but he didn't really know how to approach me. He was kind of a, the typical kind of geeky white guy. And yeah, he didn't know how to approach like a 14-year-old Black chick that, had swag, half-shaved head, all that. So yeah, so he actually offered money for me to just, hang out with him in the back of his parents' Suburban, I think. Yeah.
Have you found that other sex workers within your community also start that young, or is that more uncommon, more of a unique experience?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really feel that we're enough of a monolith to say. You kind of meet people all over the spectrum. I'll say that those of us that start younger tend to be pretty hidden about it. I had always said that I started, at about 16 or 17. But the truth is that my first trick also later that summer became my first boyfriend, the first boy I lost my virginity to, and that was at 15. So a lot of us, because of the legality, because of like the societal view on it, because of the presumption that, we've got to be like in the worst situation possible to be making these, transactions. A lot of us kind of lie about our age early on and then continue that through a lot of our lives. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a lack of helpful, productive, and healthy conversations around sex when it comes to teenagers, right? Like, I mean, we're still in that kind of abstinence only method in terms of sex education in schools, and that's just not really helpful for anyone.
Right. Yeah, it's not. And kind of like not, recognizing that children set up these economies on their own, just like children start, doing other gray and black market area things, children start selling drugs on their own. They don't need an adult to influence them into that. They just need access and availability. So kids with money naturally kind of flex their money on other kids, and sometimes specifically, to gain like sexual favor, things like that. So yeah, there's not a lot of conversation on it, and people are so squeamish about talking about, people under the age of 18 having that level of autonomy, and actually doing this stuff completely on their own, that we're really kind of missing that nuance, I think.
Yeah, for sure. There's also, I think, a lot of, and this also just comes to, the racism inherent in this judgment of, like this is something that only happens to city kids, right? Which is, there's that obviously that underlying racism behind that statement.
Right.
But did you, if you don't mind sharing, did you grow up in the city or suburbia, or, I'm coming from rural Oregon, so that's one of the reasons I ask.
I grew up mainly in metros, Detroit, Atlanta, places like that. But where I actually started sex work was kind of a suburban, more rural area, and I think that's what made me like always seem so like cool or whatever to the guys, that they were willing to, like go to that extreme, Mm-hmm. But I mean, guys buy, girls jewelry in like junior high and stuff all the time. So
do you identify as having a disability?
So I have a diagnosis of colon cancer, so there's definitely that.
If it has, how has that experience impacted your work? Has that tied into your sex work at all?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I actually, I have a degree in nursing and I worked as a nurse for a long time, but, because of race, gender, things like that, I'm just a person that's very highly fetishized. So, it's hard for me to stay in some, professional environments and stuff like that. But then, yeah, I definitely, being able to work in sex work has kind of always been my fallback, even when I'm doing, more like straight vanilla jobs or whatever, because it does allow me the flexibility and, right now, the ability to stay home with my children and, potentially look at working like 2 weeks every 6 weeks, as opposed to, leaving my children all day, every day, 5-6 days a week, things like that, trying to keep up with that, when I was on chemotherapy just would not have been a possibility. No one would have given me a year and a half off paid, nobody would have taken care of me. But, I always kind of imagined that if something happened to me, if I, became disabled, if I had some strong othering happen to me, that I would lose a lot of my marketability. But I actually found that I didn't. I had a chemo pump, a port in my chest, and an ostomy where my, intestines are partially outside and in a bag, but I still had people coming up and regularly approaching me, even, if I was in a swimsuit and the ostomy is visible and stuff. So I still had kind of that societal view of, being seen as attractive and, sexually attractive specifically. So I was still able to market on that some, and I still somehow, got through.
I think it's interesting too, because it leads to the conversation about public versus private spaces, because I feel like in public spaces, disabled people, and in media, we're often desexualized heavily, but then in private spaces, right. It's a completely different story. And it doesn't even necessarily, really sometimes it can be something like fetishization, but, other times it's just genuine attraction. And so it's interesting seeing that difference.
Yeah. People weren't put off by any amount of tubes or anything that were coming out of me. So, yeah, it was pretty wild.
So you also mentioned then being a parent. How is that? Because, obviously there's a stereotype that sex workers, or just a culture, I don't even know if it would be a stereotype so much as an assumption that sex workers aren't parents, or, how they
were having wild orgies all the time. So how are we parenting at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So how is navigating that, both the culture, societal expectations, and then also just the practical elements?
Yeah, well, I mean, to speak to it, sex workers aren't some mythical subspecies of humans that lives, on an island and only comes out, to, entice, civilians or something like that. So, we live next door to people, we work next door to people. Some of us hold regular jobs outside of, our sex work and stuff like that. The belief is definitely false. There are some of us that put in, 80 and 100 hours a week and also film out of our house and stuff like that. My schedule has never really looked like that. So navigating the societal bias, I try not to be outed in my regular life, dealing with my children's teachers, employers, things like that. It's even kind of tricky being outed in, with medical care. So I more describe, what I do and stuff when it's relevant, and I, describe my risk factors, but I try not to carry that stigma too much when I don't want to. I will say that I think I have a good bit of visibility. There was a Vice article written about me this summer that was really popular. It was trending, between number 1 and 3 on Twitter for a few days.
The Vice article to which Jay is referring was published in April of this year and written by Grace Culhane about Jay's experience being raped by a police officer and then arrested. Quote, in 2019, Jay St. James held training events on filing public records requests and also helped craft a community-funded policy platform that advocates for voting and housing justice, among a range of other issues. Chief of Police Chris Skinner knows her by name. But St. James said that on May 24, 2020, 5 years after she moved to Eugene, she was stalked and raped by Christopher Drum, a police officer in the city's police department's patrol unit. St. James also claims that after the attack, she and her family were harassed by other members of the Eugene Police Department. No charges have been brought against Drum, but St. James is now facing charges of her own after protesting her assault. Quote, the system doesn't view me as a victim, said St. James. They see me as a mess. I'm a problem. I was stalked and raped by Officer Christopher Drum, but because of the job I hold, I'm the one facing charges. End quote. St. James first met Drum roughly 3 days before the alleged rape, when Drum responded to a domestic violence call at St. James' house. That night, she said, a former romantic partner threw a beer bottle at her head and threatened to burn the house down. St. James's ex-partner also corroborated her account of a heated disagreement, which prompted her to place the call to Cahoots, though he denied the abuse allegations. St. James requested a mental health professional, but a group of uniformed police officers, all of whom were white, showed up at her house instead. Her ex-partner remembered a total of 4 officers and specifically remembered Christopher Drum. Immediately, St. James said she felt like the focus of the investigation. Quote, "All of the officers were really hostile with me as the victim." End quote. She said the officers declined to make a report or file a statement about the abuse, which lines up with the results of a Vice News records request. In a direct contradiction to the Cahoots logs, the Eugene police said they could not find an incident report at St. James's residence on May 22nd. Instead of addressing her domestic violence allegations, St. James said, Drum and his colleagues sexually harassed her. St. James's ex-partner wasn't removed from her home, and she said she was told she couldn't ask him to leave for the night. When Drum told her he wasn't filing a report, St. James said that he told her, quote, "What am I going to write down? That this guy should be smashing that ass instead of smashing bottles?" End quote. St. James told Sarah Urzua, her Civil Liberties Defense Union-trained legal observer, about the interaction the next day. Urzua said that St. James described all of these interactions in a conversation the following morning. Quote, "Officers harassed Jay after that," said Urzua. "They were coming up with what I believe to be trumped-up charges, threatening to take Jay's kids away. I personally feel like, and this is my opinion, this was an intimidation tactic," she said. "I'm a mandatory reporter. I'm a caregiver. If I had seen anything that I thought was unsafe with those children, I would have said something. That is my legal obligation, and I have seen absolutely nothing." End quote. St. James added that throughout the night, the officers made comments about her body and joked about the age difference in her relationship with her ex-partner, who was 20 years older than her. She said that Drum told her that she, quote, "didn't have to have sex with him," end quote, an unprompted comment that she claimed he made over and over. When the other officers finally left that first night, St. James said, she found Drum in her yard with her dog. For the next 3 days, St. James said that Drum continued to show up at her house unannounced. Quote, "He brought his car over. He answered a call on his radio once when he was in my house." End quote. Concerned by Drum's behavior, St. James told her ex-partner about the officer's continued presence at her house. St. James said that Drum then showed up unexpectedly and insisted on seeing her bedroom. She thought he was investigating her and eventually brought him to a guest bedroom. Then, St. James said, Drum approached her from behind and raped her twice. St. James said she reported the rape on May 28th. According to the Oregon Department of Public Safety and Standards, the following day, Drum was placed on a leave of absence. According to a personnel form from the Eugene Police Department, he resigned from the force on June 10th. Several weeks later, on July 15th, St. James gathered with a group of protesters outside the Eugene Police Department headquarters. She didn't know if Drum was still on the force and wanted accountability. But at the protest, police officers arrested St. James. She now faces felony rioting charges, although eyewitness accounts dispute the police's version of events. Lane County prosecutor Chris Perosa confirmed that St. James was charged with felony riot, interfering with a peace officer, criminal mischief in the second degree, and resisting arrest. 2 different recordings of the event show a small gathering of protesters in front of the station. The most extensive footage doesn't show St. James's face. The camera is trained on her tennis shoes while she shouts into the megaphone, and people walk back and forth in front of the camera as she's speaking. While accounts of what happened that day vary, videos of the event depict St. James shouting into a megaphone in front of the station, demanding to know whether Drum was still active on the force and accusing other members of the department of harassing her children. She had decided to protest the day before when she saw what she thought were unmarked police cars parked outside of her close friend's house where her children were staying. Wayne Johnson, one of St. James's acquaintances, saw photos of the cars posted on Facebook and called the non-emergency police hotline to ask about them. He said that the responder confirmed that the cars were from the police department's street crimes unit and were not in the neighborhood responding to a call. Although she announced that an officer involved in the investigation had called to tell her Drum resigned, she said she didn't know if it was true. Quote, "The Eugene Police Department has not made any statement acknowledging that. The city has not made any statement acknowledging that. We have no proof of that until we demand proof of that." End quote, she told the crowd. According to Johnson, who observed the protest but did not participate, the event was peaceful until St. James or another protester pulled a string of blue lights off of a wall next to the station. Quote, "That's when the police basically stormed that group of people. Probably 20-30 cops in riot gear storming out, tackled her, hit everyone to the ground around them." End quote. Johnson said he wasn't able to tell who had grabbed the lights amid all the people. St. James denies pulling the lights off the wall of the station. Quote, "I didn't touch anything," she said. "I was in front of a line of people. There's no videos of me touching anything. There's no photos of me touching anything. I didn't touch anything." End quote. The photos of St. James at the protest show her near the front steps of the police station, roughly 15 feet from where the lights hang. Quote, "I didn't touch the lights. That's something I'd be proud to claim had I done it," she said, "but I can't take credit for it," end quote. A public records request for information about the incident was denied, with the police department citing an, quote, "open court case," end quote. Photos and videos of the incident show St. James lying on the ground, hogtied and surrounded by officers. Johnson said he saw 3 officers sit on St. James's body. When she was arrested, St. James said she was separated from the other protesters and held in a cell away from view. On November 10th, a judge granted her pretrial release and permission to leave the state. Drum has not been arrested. On July 20th, 5 days after the protest and weeks after the fact, the Eugene Police Department issued a statement that an officer had resigned due to, quote-unquote, "concerning contact with a woman." While the statement doesn't mention St. James by name, the information echoes the exact timeline of her assault allegations. Eugene District Attorney Patricia Perlow declined to comment, but St. James said that a grand jury already attempted to convene without her testimony, and when her lawyer objected, the grand jury proceeding was postponed. Quote, "As long as I'm free and as long as I'm vocal, the Eugene Police Department knows there's a good chance I'm going to cooperate with Christopher Drum's grand jury hearing, and they don't want me to," said St. James. What St. James said she experienced is far from unique. A Bowling Green State University study found that roughly 1,100 police officers are arrested in the U.S. per year, or about 3 per day. Of those arrests, forcibly fondling and sexual assault comprised the 4th and 5th most common charges, respectively, with sexual assault making up 4.8% of officer arrests. Additionally, a Women in Health study found the 1 in 5 sexual assaults reported in a U.S. emergency room were filed by sex workers. In November 2019, long before St. James's assault allegations, Drum was present at the death of Eliborio Rodriguez Jr., a Eugene resident who violated city code by walking in the street instead of on the sidewalk. Drum helped restrain and handcuff Rodriguez while he was dying of gunshot wounds inflicted by another officer, according to official reports. Now, St. James isn't optimistic about the possibility of Drum facing justice. While Drum walks free, St. James was arraigned on November 2nd for her involvement in the July protest. She did not return to jail and pleaded not guilty. Quote, "I don't think Christopher Drum is going to see criminal charges, honestly," St. James said. "But the fact that a cop was forced to resign because there were enough people who would say the truth against him was really huge." End quote.
So I'm maybe a little more identifiable, and people do usually put 2 and 2 together after a bit. But, I'm the eldest of 5, and I come from, a long line of really strong vocal people on both sides. So I don't have a problem, maintaining eye contact when I need to, or, having a direct conversation on that, because I have had to, holding a nursing license. I've worked in places where their background check, brought things up and they, asked me about it. And, for some people, for some situations, it'll come down to the fact that, whether or not, you're technically breaking the law, which technically a lot of us, or a lot of everybody's always breaking the law, and a lot of sex workers are smart enough to structure our situations such that they aren't. Yeah, so for some situations, it will come down to that. For some situations, it will come down to the fact that it's just a job for me. I'm not trying to steal anybody's husband. I'm not trying to, cause a bunch of chaos in a place that I moved to or anything. I, keep my job very separate from my children, but also I wouldn't be able to parent my children as much, as effectively, and as hands-on if I wasn't able to, only work 2 hours a week or so.
Have you seen a kind of any cultural shift and more acceptance of this as people kind of learn more about it? Any destigmatization of it?
Even within, the sex worker movement, you unfortunately can have where strippers and people who do, legalized or regulated sex work don't want to be associated with people who do criminalized forms of sex work, stuff like that. Anyone who has legalized and regulated, the safety of that, in their industry might not want to use that safety to extend over those of us that are criminalized, which, that's been concerning for me to see. But then I do see among the general public, there's been, more education, more awareness. For the first time ever, they did a poll, and I think 51% of people now support the decriminalization of sex work. Whether or not they support legalization or regulation, they at least support that sex workers shouldn't be arrested, and neither should our clients.
Yeah, that makes sense. The elements of, I don't want to use the word privilege because that kind of different layers to that. Definitely hierarchy makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't even necessarily. I mean, you could look at it as privilege, but when we're all ultimately facing
absolutely
the blowback of criminalization and stuff, whether or not you know, are even in a criminalized field, I think it's just kind of like you got a slightly luckier break in a really shitty situation still.
Yeah, absolutely. So has COVID then impacted your work at all?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. COVID has, taken a lot of people out, especially if you do like in-person work. It's made me explore online a little bit more, but I'm just not someone that really has the consistency of posting that I need to, and I'm not good at following the rules, so it's hard for me to stay on site. But yeah, it's cut down for every in-person worker, whether they were filming porn or, doing erotic massage or whatever. I've definitely been affected by just the, slower client traffic, and then also like having to put up safety restrictions that drive some clients away,
Yeah, for sure. And I know that there's been a lot of online discourse about, things like OnlyFans being built up by sex workers, and now they're trying to move over and get away, like as a website. They're trying to kick off all the sex workers and make it quote unquote legitimate. So I know that there's been some larger discourses around that because of COVID. So that's definitely, and people getting censored on Instagram and things like that. So
yeah. There's been like so many more people like, flooding to sex work, or just like being open about their sex work and stuff, and branching out into different platforms, that you've definitely seen sites and applications really just kind of crack down to send a really hard message, So, and then there's there are legitimately people like me that just don't follow the rules.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
For sure. So what would you say is one of the biggest issue for sex workers in Oregon right now?
So I think that really depends on who you're talking to. There's, I would say some of the bigger ones are incarceration, the broad safety effects of outing, privacy, childcare and reproductive justice. Sex workers are so diverse and we are so multifaceted. We're just everybody. Mm-hmm. So even our like really specific issues kind of branch over all of that. We're kind of axed out of a lot of programs, but also I would say really heavily targeted by the state. I know from my personal case that before I had any arrest down in Lane County, they had collected a large amount of information on me. I think they had said that I had something like 11 incidents with them, and I definitely hadn't engaged with them that many times. But then they had another tab in their computer system that had 5, there's just there's so much information that they're collecting on people that they aren't even arresting, that they aren't even criminalizing. And sex workers definitely, whether you're a stripper, whether you work in a massage parlor, whether you work wherever, I think we're definitely having a large amount of our private information collected, and specifically by a group that's unregulated, that's LiveWires, that's kind of out there really fighting to gain their authority back right now, and that runs around unchecked.
So that kind of goes then into the next question, which is, there's an overwhelming societal belief encouraged by media that sex work is inherently harmful and dangerous. But based on your experience, if there is harm, what are some of the sources?
I think that any industry that's primarily dominated by non-men has a large amount of harassment, has a large amount of devaluing of their skills, things like that. Unfortunately, with sex work specifically, because you have this, stigma that we're all doing something criminalized, and that, morals need to be legislated and things like that, we have the police specifically, following and tracking and keeping large amounts of information on us. I feel like that's the biggest.
Yeah. Morals are kind of Christian values or whatever. It's kind of the excuse used as a way to basically police marginalized people's bodies. I mean, that's kind of the...
Right. Yeah. And the people that they presume, to be sex workers, sometimes are people just in off-age relationships, primarily Black non-men, queer and trans people we know. So, yeah, it really does end up specifically targeting marginalized groups.
If you're comfortable sharing, do you have any issues with clients then causing harm at all? Or has that not really been an issue for you?
It really hasn't been an issue. I think that my screening is pretty aggressive, and my attitude and my banter back and forth in general is pretty aggressive. So I don't have a lot of boundary pushers or anything like that. I really have not experienced, any significant or memorable harm really from clients.
That's really good to hear. Yeah, that's part of the reason that decriminalizing, from my understanding, that decriminalizing is really important, is it brings up these conversations and allows more autonomy and safety in terms of screening process for sex workers.
Yeah, definitely. But also, so I read a study that said that 75% of the sexual assaults reported by sex workers were where cops were the perpetrators. So, I mean, it also, we need to be able to have equal protection under the laws. We need to not be, specifically afraid to engage with the criminal justice and with the legal system in any way. Everybody in the legal system is a mandatory reporter and specifically or potentially going to, flag things when they find out through any way that you're involved in sex work, just, not having employment, but still having your bills paid, things like that, or when they presume that you are. But yeah, the cops specifically are the big ones that we have to worry about.
Yeah, for sure. So somebody I spoke to from the Human Rights Commission for Oregon Sex Workers, I think that was the full name, was talking about how it's important to decriminalize, but actually the next step, legalization, might cause some other issues in terms of then allowing the state too much control again over legislating certain things. Do you agree with that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think more so than the state, definitely the state, but more so than the state, you're really putting the power. What I've seen in Nevada is that you're really putting the power directly into a cherry pick group of men's hands. The brothel license, the restrictions on the number of brothel licenses that are issued per county, which counties can have them, things like that. It really becomes like this insider only process to get approved as a brothel owner. And you do end up really giving the power to civilian men. So it disempowers the workers again. Most of the brothels in Nevada charge about $900 a month in rent. Whether you're working or not, you pay that. And then you pay 50% of every appointment that you book. So, I mean, it's just this really exploitive, opportunistic environment that's created. And the only option that you have is risking criminalization on the streets, because all independent work is still criminalized in Nevada. So, I mean, what we've seen is that when they do regulation and when they do any sort of oversight into it, it becomes like oil, it becomes like tobacco, every other, big money industry. You have friends of politicians that get in it, and then they specifically limit who else can get into it. They make it inaccessible for the workers to own. They make it inaccessible for, the average person, which is maybe a good thing. But it specifically goes into the hands of predominantly rich white men, this elitist class, this, Bezos class and just under.
So then on that note, what do you wish more people knew about sex work?
I wish more people understood that the dangers, the risk, and all the harms in sex work, predominantly come from it being criminalized. You see these it come from it being criminalized and from it, being primarily non-male workers. So you see this in other industries and you see it in other fields. We just happen to hit that intersection of criminalized women, trans, and, non-men. So specifically addressing rights for sex workers is a good way to get broad protection for, people who are currently or have previously been criminalized, and for all non-men people.
How can people support the work of Black sex workers in Oregon?
Yeah, two things. Financial support, of course, financial support to collectives and to orgs that are including and elevating Black voices, like Decrim Oregon right now. I think Haymarket poll is specifically Black strippers and Black sex worker collective, but giving that financial support directly, and also education to your social network and to your family. Understand how the targeting of us specifically affects you and someone, that you care about on a broader scale. Understand that when they try to identify and track, they catch everyone in marginalized groups like we talked about, and we've seen this, with Fosta Sesta, with, the targeting that different hotels do and things like that. Be aware that there's a lot of, that you're addressing, the people who are misidentified. So you're addressing all those groups of people who are presumed to be, you're giving them better protection when you give better protection to sex workers, just because they're presumed to be, all forms of bias in all forms of society, that's against us, just really exposes the stereotypes and false beliefs that we are already holding about those groups.
So do you have any last parting thoughts or anything else that you would like to share, or something that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
A lot of disability and nonprofit groups, exclude you based on criminal records from employment, from grants, things like that. Stuff like that, makes things inaccessible to sex workers.
If you're interested in learning more about how the state violently polices sex, gender, and sexuality, this episode's recommended book is Captive Genders: Trans Embodiment and the Prison Industrial Complex by Eric A. Stanley and Nat Smith. The link to purchase this book can be found in the episode description, or check it out and support your local library. Thanks again to Corinne Hawk and Jay St. James for speaking with me. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOSIL. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, legality does not equal morality.